3 years alone, 2 graves under a cottonwood tree, and a man who buried his whole heart alongside them. Then she came, all silk and pearl buttons and poetry books, completely wrong for this land. And he didn't welcome her, didn't warm to her, didn't say more than 10 words in the first 2 weeks. But when the fever hit, he never left her side. Not once. Not for a single hour. What do you call a man like that? And what does a woman do when she finally understands him? This channel tells the stories the frontier never got to finish, of love that doesn't announce itself, of compassion that asks nothing in return, of ordinary people doing extraordinary things for the ones beside them. What this story gives you: permission to trust someone whose love is written in actions, even when their words will never come easily. Subscribe and share this with someone who loves quietly. They'll know exactly who they are.
The stagecoach door creaked open, and a wave of dust rolled in like an unwelcome guest. Clara Ashford clutched her travel case, her mother of pearl buttons and dove-gray silk looking mighty out of place as she stepped into the harsh sunlight of Sagebrush Hollow. She looked like a woman who had missed her turn back around Kansas and just decided to keep on going. She glanced along the boardwalk at the weathered faces, the women in their calico bonnets, and a hound dog scratching an itch in a sliver of shade. Nobody stepped forward to greet her. She had his picture memorized, with that square jaw and those hollow eyes. The letter promised he would be waiting. That letter had promised a whole mess of things. Then a man stepped out from the long shadow of the general store. He was tall, baked by the sun, with his hat pulled down low. He walked her way without any hurry, stopped about 3 feet short of her, and just looked at her trunk. "Miss Ashford," he stated it more than asked. "Yes, you must be him." He bent down, grabbed the trunk, and headed for a buckboard wagon at the far end of the street. There was no handshake, no smile, not even a tip of his hat. Clara was left standing all by herself in the swirling dust, her gloved hand still hanging in the air where a greeting should have been. If this tale has started to stir something familiar in your heart, we would be mighty grateful for your support. It helps us keep bringing these kinds of stories to good people like you. We thank you kindly for being here. 6 long hours on that wagon. Clara's back was aching something fierce against the hard wooden seat. Her throat felt as dry as a creek bed in August, but she never said a word about needing water. The canvas water bag dangled from a hook right by his elbow, but he never offered her a drop. She tried to make conversation 2, maybe 3 times. His answers were nothing more than grunts and single words. After the 4th try, she gave up. The sun made its slow journey across that big Texas sky, and finally dipped behind the hills to the west. The ranch house came into view in the fading purple light. It was just 4 walls, a tin roof, and a porch holding one lonely rocking chair. Silas hauled her trunk inside without saying a word. The door groaned open. Clara stepped over the threshold and just froze. There was a cast-iron stove, a table made from rough-cut planks, and 2 chairs that did not match. The walls were bare, the windows were bare, with no curtains, no pictures, and no flowers. The whole place smelled of old wood smoke and something else she could not quite name. Emptiness. The kind that seeps right into the floorboards when a house has not heard laughter in a long, long time. She unpacked her things real slow: silk ribbons, a silver-backed hand mirror, a leather-bound book of Tennyson's poetry. She placed the mirror on the windowsill where it caught the very last ray of light, casting a bright square on the plain wall behind her. It all looked so foolish, like wearing fancy costume jewelry to a funeral. Silas showed up in the doorway. He just pointed to a small room off the main one. "The bedroom is in there. I will be in the barn." He rubbed the back of his neck, then turned and closed the door behind him. Clara got to making supper. Beans and biscuits. She burned them both. The beans formed a black crust stuck to the bottom of the pot, and the biscuits came out heavy as stones from the river. She put his plate down in front of him and watched as he ate every single bite. He did not wince or make a single comment. "Thank you," he said, after the plate was scraped clean. Just those two words. Then she heard the scrape of his chair, the clink of his plate in the wash basin, and the sound of the door opening and closing. He was gone. Clara sat all alone at that table. The coal oil lamp hissed and its flame danced. Shadows leaned in from all the corners of the room. She started counting the knotholes in the wooden planks. 7. She counted them all over again. Outside, a soft yellow light appeared in the barn window. He was still up, just 20 feet away from her. She pressed the palm of her hand flat against the cold window pane and just stared at that faraway light until her whole hand felt numb. What kind of man could eat burned beans without so much as a flinch, but could not bring himself to look his own wife in the eye? The days started to run together. Clara would wake up every morning to the smell of coffee that had already been brewed. The stove would be warm, and the front door would be propped open, letting in the cool morning air. Silas was always long gone by the time her bare feet hit the cold floorboards. She would watch him through the window as he mended the split-rail fence that ran along the north pasture. She watched him haul water from the creek in big wooden buckets that left dark, wet streaks in the dirt. He checked the hooves of the bay mare, one leg at a time, patient as a stone. He moved with the smooth rhythm of a man who had been doing these chores by himself for years and years. There was no wasted movement, no second-guessing. She started to notice his hands. They were large and calloused, with knuckles that were scarred and darkened by the sun. He handled his tools the same way other men might handle a deck of cards, with a certainty that was quick and familiar. One morning, a big commotion out in the corral drew her to the porch. A young colt, a chestnut color, maybe a year old, was pacing along the fence line, with its eyes wide and wild and its ears pinned back flat. It kicked hard at the rails when Clara took a step closer, so she stopped right where she was. Silas came around the side of the barn. He did not even look her way. He just opened the corral gate and stepped right inside. He did not have a rope in his hands or a whip or anything at all. He just stood there perfectly still with his palms open by his sides. The colt snorted and circled him. Its hooves kicked up little clouds of dust. It tossed its head back and forth, showing the whites of its eyes. Silas did not move a muscle. The colt circled him again, but slower this time. Its ears flicked forward, then back, then forward again as Silas just waited. Minutes ticked by. Clara's fingers tightened their grip on the porch rail. The morning sun climbed up higher in the sky. Somewhere behind the barn, a rooster crowed twice. The colt stopped. It stood about 10 feet away from Silas, its sides rising and falling fast, its nostrils flared wide. Then it took one step and then another. It stretched its neck out toward him, the muscles shaking under its dusty coat. Silas lifted one hand so slow it looked like he was moving it through water. His palm found the colt's neck. He stroked it once, then twice. The colt's head lowered. Its whole body seemed to let out a long breath. Clara felt her own breath catch in her throat. Those hands, the very same hands that had not touched her even once since she arrived, were as rough as old tree bark against that trembling neck, but as gentle as anything she had ever witnessed. The very next morning, she did not stand and wait by the window. She found a bucket near the door to the hen house and picked it up. Silas looked at her, and then he looked down at the bucket. His eyebrows went up about 1/4 of an inch, which was the most expression she had seen on his face in 2 weeks. He took the bucket from her hands. He showed her how to hold it low against her hip so the chickens could not knock it clean over when they came rushing for their feed. He did not lecture her, he did not sigh. He just gently moved her hands into the right position and then stepped away. The feed trough was next. She learned to check for rust along the bottom edge, where water liked to pool up and rot right through the metal. The hand pump took 3 hard pulls before the water came out clear. The sky could tell you things if you just learned how to read it. Clouds piling up in the west meant you would have rain by nightfall. Clouds moving fast and flat just meant wind and nothing more. Silas taught her all of it without using words. He would give a nod when she did it right, and a shake of his head when she did not. He never once snatched a tool from her hands or rolled his eyes at her. He just waited while she figured it out for herself, and then they would move on to the next chore. Her palms got blisters. Then they got calloused. The blisters had hurt something awful. The calluses did not. By the end of her second week there, her biscuits had stopped looking like river stones. Silas took a second helping one evening. He did not say anything about it, but he took them. One evening, Clara came inside to get supper started, and she stopped dead in the doorway. There were wildflowers sitting on the kitchen table, purple sage and yellow columbine. A little bit of dirt was still clinging to their roots. The stems were wrapped up in a piece of wet burlap and were leaning against the salt cellar. There was no note, no ribbon, just wildflowers. They were plain and simple, like someone had just plucked them from the earth 5 minutes before. The barn door was already shut for the night, and the lamp inside was already lit. Clara walked over to the table and touched one of the petals with the tip of her finger. It was soft and still cool from the shady spot where it had grown. Her mother's voice came to her then, rising up from some deep place inside. "Watch what a man does, child. Any fool can talk pretty." She found an old tin cup in the cupboard, filled it with water from the pump, and arranged the flowers inside. It was a clumsy arrangement, with the stems too long and the cup too narrow, but she set it on the windowsill where the morning sun would be sure to find them. Then she sat herself down at the table with a piece of paper and a pen. She wrote a long letter to her sister Catherine back in New York, 4 whole pages. She told Catherine all about the journey and the dust and the silence, and about the man who spoke to her with coffee and crooked curtains and wildflowers wrapped up in burlap. She folded the letter up, slipped it inside an envelope, and wrote the address in her neatest handwriting. But she did not mail it. That letter sat on the shelf right beside her book of Tennyson's poems for 3 days, and then for a whole week. She would look at it sometimes, pick it up, and then put it right back down. If she mailed it, Catherine would surely write back, and Catherine would ask questions. Catherine would want to know if Clara was happy, if this had all been a terrible mistake, if she wanted to come back home. Clara did not know how to answer any of those questions just yet. She was learning a whole new language. The words were strange ones, like buckets and blisters and purple sage in a tin cup. But she was finally starting to understand the grammar. On the morning of her 3rd week, Clara woke up before the sun. She got dressed in the dark, pulled on the ugly, practical brown leather work boots she had bought in town, and walked on out to the corral. Silas was already there. He was brushing down the bay mare when she walked up. His eyes lifted from the horse, traveled down to her worn-out boots, then came back to her face. Something in his expression changed right then. It was not quite a smile, but it was the closest thing she had seen on him. He offered her the brush. She reached out and took it. For just a moment, their fingers brushed against each other. Both their hands were rough and calloused. Then he took a step back, giving her space to work. The sun finally peeked over the ridge to the east. The light touched the barn roof first, then the corral fence, and finally lit up the mare's chestnut hide. Clara slid the brush along the horse's side, feeling the big animal relax into the touch. She never heard him walk away, but when she glanced over her shoulder, Silas was gone. The barn door was wide open, and sitting on the fence post right in front of her was a pair of old leather work gloves. They were far too big for her, but she slipped them on anyway. A new rhythm slowly found her. Clara started waking up before the sun. She learned the sound of the 3rd floorboard, the one that always complained if you put your weight on it. She learned how to navigate the dark kitchen without a sound, her hands finding the coffee pot, the tin cups, and the matchbox next to the stove. Silas always got up earlier, but things had changed. Now, when she came outside, holding a warm cup in her hands, he would give her one quick nod before turning back to his work. By the 6th week, she could understand his silence, just like she used to read music. A short grunt from him meant something was good. A long sigh through his nose meant it was not quite right. A little shake of his head, so small you could barely see it, meant she should stop before she got hurt. And on rare occasions, he would give a nod while looking her right in the eye, which was his way of giving praise. She also learned to read the land. She knew which pasture stayed in the shade the longest in the morning, and where the creek was shallow enough to cross. She saw how the cattle would huddle together right before a storm, with their heads down and their tails turned against the wind. Her mornings were the chickens, and the butter churn. The handle moved up and down in her grip, a steady pull and release, until her shoulders ached, and the cream finally turned into soft yellow butter. In the afternoon, she would work near Silas, staying out of his way but close enough to help. She would hand him nails as he fixed the barn door, or hold the mare's bridle while he checked her shoes. She learned that silence did not have to feel empty. Their suppers were different, too. They were still quiet, but now Silas would look up when she put his plate down, meeting her eyes for a second before looking at his food. He started taking a second helping of her biscuits without her asking. One time, she saw him use a piece of bread to wipe up the last bit of gravy from his plate. He never said a word about it, but he cleaned that plate completely. The wagon showed up on a Tuesday afternoon, 6 weeks and 3 days after Clara had first arrived in Sagebrush Hollow. She heard it long before she saw it, that familiar rattle of wheels on the dirt road and the jingle of the harness. She walked out onto the porch and shielded her eyes from the sun. A woman with a round face and gray hair tucked under a bonnet sat on the wagon seat. She was waving her arm like she was trying to stop a train. "Hello there," she called out. "You must be the new Mrs. Drifter." Clara's hand tightened on the porch railing. She had not thought of herself in that way. The woman climbed down from the wagon much faster than Clara expected. A tall, skinny man followed her, moving slowly as if his joints were bothering him. "I'm Martha Holloway." The woman grabbed Clara's hand with both of hers and gave it 2 firm shakes. "And that over there is Ezra. Don't pay him any mind. He is a man of few words." She leaned in and whispered loudly, "Looks like you have the same situation around here." "I'm Clara. Please, come on inside. I will put on some coffee." Martha Holloway had enough conversation for 4 people. She made herself at home in one of the kitchen chairs like she had been coming over for years. Her eyes scanned the room, noticing the wildflowers on the windowsill, the lack of curtains, and the plain walls that Clara had not gotten around to decorating. "Lord have mercy," Martha said with a sigh. "This place sure does need a woman's touch, and badly." She gave Clara's arm a gentle pat. "It is a good thing you got here when you did." Ezra sat quietly by the stove and did not say a word. He had kind eyes, though. He gave Clara a single nod and seemed happy to let his wife do all the talking. And Martha certainly did. She explained that the community had church meetings once a month over at the Fenton place, about 8 miles south. People held barn raisings whenever a neighbor needed one, which was often. She said that Mrs. Patterson baked the best apple pie in 3 counties, but refused to share the recipe, which was a real sin and a shame. "Folks have to look out for one another here," Martha said seriously. "The closest real town is 40 miles away, and the nearest doctor is 60. If you get into real trouble out here, your neighbors are the ones who will come to help you, or no one will." Clara refilled their coffee cups. "How long have you known Silas?" Martha's expression softened. "I've known him since he was just a little boy, running around this property with no shoes on. I watched him grow up on this land." She held her cup with both hands. "His parents were good folks, Henry and Ruth. The salt of the earth, both of them. A fever took them about 3 years ago. It swept through the whole valley that summer, but it hit this ranch the worst." Martha shook her head slowly. "Ruth passed away first. Henry was gone 4 days later. I guess he just could not imagine living without her. Some men are just built that way." A lump formed in Clara's throat. Silas had never said anything. "He would not," Martha said, setting her cup down. "Bless his heart, that man would not complain if his own boots were on fire. He buried them both by himself. He did not ask for any help and did not want any. He just dug the graves under that big cottonwood tree out back, and then he just kept on living." She paused for a moment. "If you can even call that living." Ezra finally spoke, his voice as quiet as falling leaves. "He is a good man," Martha nodded in agreement. "The best kind. The quiet kind. The kind of man who is there when you need him and never expects anything in return. Her gaze sharpened as she looked at Clara. I told Ezra when we heard he had sent for a bride, I said, "That girl either has grit or she has nothing." Now, looking at you, with calluses on your hands and a bit of dirt under your nails, she smiled. It looks to me like you have got plenty of grit. Clara looked down at her own hands. Martha was right. The calluses were thick, and her skin was darker from the sun. These were not the hands of a woman who once attended fancy dances and wore silk gloves for afternoon tea. "Do you want my advice?" Martha asked, leaning in closer. "Do not try to change him. Just stand beside him long enough and he will start to fix himself." They left about an hour later. Martha gave Clara a hug like they were old friends. Ezra just shook her hand firmly one time and did not say another word. "If you need anything at all," Martha shouted from the wagon, "you just send for us. We are 5 miles to the east, right past the creek with the bent cottonwood tree." Clara stood and watched them leave until the dust from the wagon settled. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the yard. She stayed there for a long time, thinking about a young man who had to dig 2 graves all by himself, fill them up all by himself, and then walk back to an empty house all by himself. 3 years of silence. 3 years of eating at a table meant for 2, but with only one person there. That evening, Clara made coffee, the way he liked it, strong and black. She carried the cup out to the barn. The door was open and the light from a lantern spilled out onto the dirt. She could hear him inside, the steady sound of a brush against a horse's coat, and the soft noise of the mare shifting her weight. Clara walked through the doorway. Silas looked up, stopping the brush in midair, his eyebrows raised just a tiny bit. She placed the cup on a bale of hay near his arm, then turned and began to walk back to the house. His voice made her stop right at the door. "Clara?" It was just her name, nothing more. But there was something in how he said it. It was not flat or empty. There was a feeling underneath it that she could not quite figure out. She turned her head slightly, but did not look all the way back. "Yes?" There was a long pause, just long enough for the mare to snort and stomp her foot. "The coffee is good." Clara gave a single nod, then walked out into the cool evening air. She crossed the yard and went up the porch steps. By the time she got to the kitchen, her hands were shaking. She pressed them down flat on the edge of the stove and just stood there, looking at her own reflection in the dark window. She was smiling. She had no idea when she had started. Later that night, as she lay awake on the mattress filled with corn husks, Clara listened to the quiet of the house. It did not feel so empty anymore. It felt like a space that was just waiting to be filled. He had said her name, for the very first time since she came. She placed her hand over her heart and could feel it beating strongly. What other feelings were hidden beneath all of that silence? The fever started on a Thursday morning. Clara woke up with a terrible headache, and her skin felt like it was on fire. She tried to get out of bed, but the whole room seemed to tilt to one side. She had to grab onto the bedpost and wait for the world to stop spinning. She told herself it was just a cold, or maybe just her body finally giving in to weeks of hard work it was not used to. She managed to get to the kitchen and start the coffee. Her hands were shaking so much that coffee grounds scattered all over the top of the stove like black snow. She clumsily tried to sweep them up and start over. An hour later, Silas found her slumped over the kitchen table. She heard the sound of his boots on the floorboards. She felt his hand, calloused and warm, pressed down on her forehead. He made a sound deep in his chest, not a word, something wilder than that. Next thing she knew, his arms were scooping her up. She watched the ceiling beams drift by in a slow parade. Then the bedroom doorway before the corn husk mattress rose up to catch her. "Stay," he said. Just that one word, a command. She was too weak to even think about fighting it. The next 4 days melted together like a painting left in a hard rain. Clara faded in and out of knowing where she was. Sometimes the room was filled with bright afternoon sun, cutting sharp lines through the empty window. Other times it was pure dark, with the coal oil lamp on the bedside table sputtering, making shadows leap and dance whenever the wind pushed through the walls. But every single time she managed to open her eyes, Silas was right there, sitting in a ladder-backed chair he had pulled up close to the bed. His hat was off, and his brown hair, longer than she had figured, was a tangled mess across his forehead. He was holding a bowl in his big hands with little white wisps of steam curling up from it. "Broth," he told her. "Drink." She drank the chicken broth. It was salty and hot and felt good. It stung her throat on the way down, but she did not care one bit. Her throat had gotten so dry she had forgotten what it even felt like to swallow. A cool cloth just appeared on her forehead. She never saw him dip it in the water bucket, never saw him wring it out. But there it was, wet and cold against her feverish skin. The relief hit so fast it made her eyes water. When the cloth got warm, he would replace it, over and over and over. Sometime in that first long night, Clara woke up to the sound of his voice, low and rough, like it was not used to being used. He was reading from a book, one bound in leather with the cover worn soft at the edges and cracked down the spine. It was his mother's Bible. Clara knew it from the shelf where it had sat, gathering dust, since the day she got there. "The Lord is my shepherd," he read, his words stumbling over the rhythm of the verses. "I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth—" He stopped for a moment. He tried it again. "He restoreth my soul." His voice hitched on that last word. He cleared his throat and just kept on reading, turning page after page, going through psalm after psalm. The words washed over Clara like a gentle creek over river stones, smoothing out her sharp edges, filling in the cracks, and washing away all the things that did not need to be there anymore. She closed her eyes and just let herself float on the sound. She did not know if he was reading for her benefit or for his own. It truly did not matter. On the morning of the 5th day, her fever finally broke. Clara opened her eyes to a soft gray dawn and a mind that felt clear. Her body ached all over, like she had been trampled by a whole herd of horses. But the fire inside her was gone. The room stayed put when she turned her head. The walls were not tilting anymore. Silas was fast asleep in the chair, his chin resting on his chest. The Bible was laying open on his lap. His hand was still laid out flat on the thin paper, like he'd nodded off right in the middle of a verse. Dark, bruised-looking circles sat under his eyes. His jaw was covered in 4 days of stubble. Could have been 5. He had not gone anywhere, not once. He didn't do his chores. He didn't stop for a meal. He didn't get any sleep that wasn't snatched right here in this hard wooden chair next to her bed. Clara just watched him breathe, a slow and steady rhythm. His chest lifted and fell under his faded cotton shirt. A lump formed in her throat. She looked away toward the wall and blinked hard to stop the stinging in her eyes. When she turned back, his own eyes were open, and he was watching her. "Feeling better?" he asked. His voice was hoarse, scraped raw from reading out loud for 4 whole nights. "Better," he nodded his head one time, then stood up. His knees made a loud popping sound in the still room. The noise of joints kept bent for far too long. He placed the Bible on the table by the bed and walked straight out without saying another thing. Clara heard the front door swing open, the sound of his boots on the porch, and then the creak of the barn door groaning on its old hinges. She stayed right there for a good long while, her hand just resting on the worn leather of his mother's Bible. The next morning, she managed to stand up without the whole room spinning around her. She got dressed, taking her sweet time. Every little move took something out of her. Her legs felt like they didn't belong to her, all weak and shaky, like they were borrowed from somebody else. But she got herself all the way to the bedroom door, gave it a push, and then she just stopped. There were curtains hanging in the windows. They were made of a rough cotton, a faded blue color, like a work shirt that had been washed 100 times over. The bottom edges were all crooked. You could tell they were cut with shears made for thick leather, and stitched by hands that were better at fixing a harness than sewing. One side hung a whole inch lower than the other one. Clara walked across the room and touched the material. It was soft from being washed. Somebody had washed it before they put it up. Somebody had bothered to think of that. Her gaze drifted over to the windowsill. A jar of wildflowers was sitting there, purple sage and yellow columbine, just like the ones from before. But these were fresh. The water in the jar was still clear. The petals had not even started to wilt yet. She turned and looked back toward the bed. A small shelf had been nailed to the wall right next to the headboard. It was just raw wood, but somebody had sanded the edges down smooth so a person would not get a splinter. It was just wide enough to hold 3 or 4 books. Her book of Tennyson's poems was already sitting there, with the title facing out, placed just so. Silas was standing in the kitchen doorway, his hands just hanging limp at his sides. He was not looking at her, though. He was looking at the floorboards, at the little dust motes dancing in the morning sun, at anything and everything except for her face. The very tips of his ears were bright red. "Don't fit right," he said, his voice coming out all rough and defensive. "The curtains, I can take them down. Do them over if you want." "They are perfect." He cleared his throat. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other. He rubbed the back of his neck with a calloused hand. "The shelf, too. If it is not level, I can fix it." "It is perfect." He gave a single nod, sharp and quick. Then he turned on his heel and walked right out. The door banged shut behind him. His boots clomped across the porch fast, like he was almost running. Clara stood all alone in the kitchen, her hands still resting on the crooked curtain fabric. Her chest hurt, but it was not from the fever. It was from something else entirely, something that had nothing to do with being sick. That evening they sat at the table together. The coal oil lamp flickered between them, casting a low light. Clara's hands were wrapped around a cup of coffee she had not even sipped. Silas was just staring at a spot on the wall somewhere over her left shoulder, his jaw set hard, his fingers tapping out a slow, steady beat on the tabletop. The silence stretched out between them. But it was a different kind of quiet now, one that was full of all the things that needed to be said. Clara was the one who spoke first. "Will you tell me about them, your parents?" Silas's jaw got even tighter. A muscle twitched under the stubble on his cheek. For a long, tense moment, she thought he was not going to answer her at all. She thought she had pushed him too far, asked for something she had no right to, that she had broken something delicate that was only just starting to mend. Then, slow and heavy, like a stone sinking in a deep creek, the words finally came. "Pa taught me to work." He paused. The lamp flame jumped. A little moth fluttered against the hot glass chimney. "Ma taught me to pray." He paused again, this time for longer. His fingers stopped their drumming. They went quick. "That is something, I reckon. Fever took them both inside of a week. Some folks hang on for months. They did not." He stopped and swallowed hard. She could see his Adam's apple bob in his throat. "Buried them under the cottonwood. Out back." His voice got so quiet that Clara had to lean in to hear him. "Ma, she liked that tree. Used to sit under it in the evenings after all the work was done. Said the leaves sounded like water running over rocks." He stopped talking then. His hands were lying flat on the table, palms down, fingers spread wide. His knuckles had turned white from how hard he was pressing them down. Clara eased her hand across the small space on the table. She laid it right on top of his. She could feel the thick calluses, the faint lines of old scars, and the tension running through him like a barbed wire fence pulled too tight. He did not pull his hand away. He did not squeeze hers back either. He just let it be. He let her hand rest there, letting the warmth pass between them in the quiet room. The oil lamp flickered, burning lower. The shadows in the corners stretched out long and thin. Outside, a lone coyote cried out somewhere in the dark hills. Another one answered from a long way off. Clara's thumb brushed over the thickest callus on his palm, a hard ridge of skin at the base of his finger, built from a lifetime of gripping tools and reins. She traced it slow, feeling the roughness, feeling all the years of hard work that were stored there. Silas's breath hitched just one time, so quiet she almost missed it. He turned his hand over real slow and careful, like he was holding something fragile, until his palm was facing up and her fingers settled right into the hollow of his hand. They just sat like that. They sat there until the lamp sputtered and went out, until the room was swallowed by darkness. Clara could not see his face any longer. She could only feel the rough warmth of his skin on hers. When she finally moved to get up for bed, he spoke her name. Clara. She stopped, her hand on the bedroom door. I ain't. He paused, then tried to start over. Words just don't come easy for me. Never have. I know, she said softly. But Another pause, this one longer. The darkness hid his face, but it could not hide the weight in his voice. I am glad you are better. Clara could not see him, but she could hear everything hiding underneath those simple words. All the things he could not say, the things he might never find the words for. I am glad too, she whispered back. She slipped into the bedroom, closed the door, and leaned her back against the rough wood. She stood there in the pitch black, her hand still feeling warm from where his had held it. Outside, the wind was starting to pick up. The new curtain shifted against the window frame, making a soft brushing sound against the glass, almost like a sigh. And somewhere far off to the north, past the mountains, past the high plains where the wild cattle roamed, thunder rumbled low and long all across the horizon. Like a final warning, the heat came down like a hammer. Clara woke up every morning to air so thick and heavy it felt like you could chew it. The creek down behind the barn had shrunk down to nothing but a muddy crack in the earth. The cattle huddled together under the few cottonwood trees, their sides heaving, too worn out from the heat to even think about grazing. Silas started riding out before the sun came up each day. He would saddle his bay mare in the dark and point her north toward the ridgeline. From the porch, Clara would watch him go, the coffee in her hands going cold. He would come back hours later, dust settled deep in the lines of his face, and a hard look in his eyes. What are you looking for out there? She finally asked him one evening. He stood at the water pump, splashing his face and neck, the water running down his collar and making his shirt dark. He straightened up, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. A wild herd. He nodded to the north, toward the mountains that stood blue and hazy against the sky. Old ranches up in that high country. Folks just walked away during the bad years, left the cattle behind. They bred, went wild. Clara waited, knowing he was not finished. This drought is pushing them down. They are looking for water, for grass. He shook his head, water dripping from his hair onto his shoulders. If they come down through the valley when a storm hits, he trailed off. What happens then? They will stampede. 300 head, maybe more. They will flatten everything that gets in their way. Fences, crops, our own animals. He looked straight at her. Houses. Clara's grip tightened on the porch railing. Can't somebody stop them? Not stop them. Turn them. He reached for the towel hanging by the pump and dried his face. Somebody would have to ride right into the middle of them, turn the lead cattle and push the whole herd toward the eastern basin. It is empty land out there, nothing for them to destroy. Somebody. He did not answer. He just walked past her into the house and did not say another word that night. The signs got worse over the next few days. There were dust clouds on the northern horizon. This was not wind dust, it was something heavier, something that moved with a purpose. Clara could see it in the afternoons, a brown smudge against a pale sky. Their own cattle got spooked. They paced the fence line instead of eating. The milk cow kicked the bucket over twice. The chickens would not go into the hen house to roost until it was completely dark. Silas rode out one afternoon and came back with his jaw set hard as a rock. He unsaddled the mare without a word, brushed her down without a word. He walked to the porch where Clara was waiting and stopped at the bottom step. How many? She asked. 300, he said. Maybe more. How close? 2 days out? Maybe 3. He looked to the north, even though you could not see anything from here but low hills and an empty sky. A storm is coming too, I can smell it, Clara. Could not smell anything but dust and dry grass. But she did not doubt him for a second. What are we going to do? Meeting tomorrow. Holloway's place. Everybody is coming. He walked up the steps and stopped next to her. For a second, his hands started to lift like he was going to touch her arm, or her shoulder, or her face. Then he just let it drop back down to his side. Make some extra biscuits, he said. We will bring them along. The Holloway barn was packed. Clara counted 15 people. They were ranchers and farmers from all the spreads scattered across the valley, with their weathered faces and their worried eyes. They stood around in little groups between the hay bales and the empty stalls, talking in low voices that died down the second Silas walked in. Martha Holloway pushed a cup of water into Clara's hands. Lord have mercy, she said. You would think the end of the world was coming, the way these men are carrying on. Ezra stood over by the big barn door with 2 other men Clara did not know, and their voices carried in the thick, still air. 300 head, easy, maybe even more. They are coming down through Miller's Canyon. That is a straight shot to the valley floor. If that storm hits while they are on the run, there will not be a thing left standing. The whole barn went quiet. Everybody looked toward the middle of the room, where a single kerosene lantern hung from a nail, throwing long shadows across the dirt floor. An older man Clara had never seen before spoke first, with a gray beard and hands that looked like knotted rope. We ain't got the men to turn a herd that size, not with us spread out so thin. Another voice, this one younger, chimed in. What about the Eastern Basin? If we could just push them that way. Push them how? You planning on riding into a stampede all by yourself? I did not say that. Ain't nobody here got that many cowboys, but ain't nobody here that crazy either. The voices started to rise and overlap, arguments and plans and the fear that was underneath it all. Clara just watched Silas. He stood off to the side of the group, his arms crossed over his chest, his face impossible to read. He had not said a single word since they got there. Ezra Holloway raised a hand, and the barn fell silent again. I have seen men try to turn a stampede before, he said, his voice calm and flat. I have seen them buried, too. A heavy silence filled the barn. Next to Clara, Martha made a little sound halfway between a sigh and a prayer. Then Silas uncrossed his arms and took a step forward. The lantern light hit his face, and Clara saw something in it she had not seen before. It was not fear. It was something older and harder. It was resignation. Maybe. I will do it. The words fell into the quiet like stones dropped in a deep well. The gray-bearded man just shook his head. By yourself, Silas? That is, I know those canyons. I know how the herd runs. If I can just get out ahead of them, hit the lead steers before they reach the valley floor, you will get yourself killed, son. Silas just shrugged one shoulder. Might. Ezra stepped up close. He put a weathered hand on Silas's arm. Son, you ride into that herd alone. You might not ride out. Then I will not get buried. A beat. I do not aim to, anyway. Martha's voice cut right through the tension in the barn. Lord, that man has got more stubborn in his little finger than most people have in their whole body. A few of the men let out short, nervous laughs. The tension cracked, but it did not break. The meeting ended about an hour later. They had made plans and talked about what-ifs, but everybody there knew the truth. It all came down to one man, one horse, and a whole lot of luck. Clara found Silas outside by the barn. He was checking his mare's cinch strap, running his hands over the leather like he was already getting ready. She grabbed his arm. He stopped and turned to her. You cannot go alone. Her voice came out sharper than she meant for it to. There has to be some other way. He looked at her then, and the moonlight caught in his eyes. For just a second, something in his face changed. It opened up. She saw the fear he had been hiding in the barn. She saw the doubt and the terrible weight of what he had volunteered to do. Somebody has to, he said. Then let it be somebody else. There ain't nobody else. He pulled his arm away from her, gentle but firm. This is what I do. Clara, this is what I've always done. I look after folks. I keep them safe. He paused. The only difference now is I have got something to come back to. He walked over to his horse, swung up into the saddle, and looked down at her. That storm will hit tomorrow night, maybe the night after. He gathered up the reins. I will be back. That is a promise. And with that, he rode off into the dark. Clara stood in the Holloway's yard and watched until she could not see him anymore, until the sound of his horse's hoofbeats faded away into nothing. Martha came and stood beside her and pressed something into her hand. It was a handkerchief. Clara had not even realized she was crying. "Come on inside, child," Martha said. "There is nothing to do now but wait and pray." Clara looked to the north. The stars were vanishing one by one, behind clouds she could not see. The whole feel of the air had changed. It was heavier now, charged, like the sky itself was holding its breath. And somewhere out there, beyond those clouds, 300 head of wild cattle were on the move, toward the valley. And somewhere out in that mess, her husband was riding all by his lonesome into the dark. That storm hit right around dusk. Clara just stood by the window, watching the sky go from a sickly green to pure black. Lightning tore the horizon open with jagged white scars. The thunder that followed wasn't some far-off rumble. It was a deep, bone-rattling crash that shook dust from the rafters and made the window glass tremble in its frame. Then came the rain, and it didn't come gentle or slow. It was a solid wall of water that slammed into the house like some kind of living, angry thing. The windows groaned under the weight of it. The new curtain Silas hung, the crooked one, swayed in the draft that found its way through every last crack and seam. He had been gone for an hour. She had watched him saddle the mare in that strange green light right before the sky broke open. Watched him check that cinch strap 2, maybe 3 times. Watched him swing up into the saddle and point that horse north without a single look back. She had wanted to run right after him, to grab the reins and beg him not to go, but she never moved from that porch. Now she just pressed her forehead against the cold glass and stared out into all that chaos. Rain poured down the window in sheets so thick she couldn't make out the barn, couldn't see the corral, couldn't see a blessed thing but water and darkness and the flash of white light that burned shapes behind her eyes long after it was gone. The clock on the mantel just kept ticking, slow, steady, like it didn't have a care in the world. Clara moved over to the table and sat, wrapping both hands around a coffee cup that had turned cold hours ago. She thought about New York, about the brownstone on Lexington Avenue, her room with its rose-patterned wallpaper, and the lace curtains her mother had special ordered from France. She thought of the suitors who would come calling on Sunday afternoons, young fellas in pressed suits with practiced smiles and compliments they had rehearsed in a mirror. "Miss Ashford, you look simply divine this evening. Miss Ashford, might I have this dance?" Just words, pretty words, smooth words, words that slid off the tongue like warm butter and meant absolutely nothing at all. Not a single one of those men would ride into a storm for strangers. Not one of them would risk his own hide for neighbors he hardly knew. None of them would lift a finger if it meant wrinkling their fancy linen shirts or scuffing up their polished boots. Lightning flashed. Thunder cracked so loud. The whole house shook and the lamp chimney rattled in its holder. Clara flinched. Coffee slopped over the rim of her cup, making a dark, spreading stain on the table. She didn't bother to wipe it up. The clock ticked on. 9 o'clock, 10, 11. Clara tried to pray. The words just came out all wrong in little broken pieces. Scraps of hymns she half remembered from Sundays as a little girl in the family pew. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not." The thunder drowned out the rest of it. The whole house trembled. She started again. "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow." A flash of lightning, real close this time, turned the whole room white for a heartbeat, then threw it back into darkness. The shadow of... She couldn't recall what came next. The words just scattered like chickens in a storm and wouldn't come back. Midnight. The storm wasn't showing any sign of letting up. Clara stood up. Her legs were stiff from sitting so long. She walked to the window, then back to the table, then to the window again. Her boots made squishing sounds on the floorboards. She'd tracked mud inside earlier without even noticing. She picked up the coffee cup, set it down, and picked it right back up again. She counted the knotholes in the table. 7. Same as always. The same as that first night she sat here all alone, wondering what in the world kind of man she had married. She counted them again. 7. 1 o'clock. 2. Her hands just would not stop shaking. She pressed them flat against the table. They trembled anyway. She pressed them against her thighs. Her legs started shaking too. She thought about that wild herd. 300 head of cattle, maybe more, running blind through the storm, their hooves sounding like thunder. On the canyon floor, the whites of their eyes showing in pure terror. She thought about Silas riding right into the middle of them. Just one man and one horse, a coat to wave and a voice to shout, and nothing else between him and all that crushing, stampeding weight. She thought about hooves, about falling, about the mud churned up by hundreds of panicked animals. Her stomach turned over. She made it to the door, wrenched it open, and got to the edge of the porch before her knees gave out, and everything came up. She was sick right into the rain. Coffee and bile and nothing else. She hadn't eaten a bite since morning. Her body heaved again and again, until there was nothing left and she was just gagging on air, her whole body convulsing with the effort. The rain soaked through her dress in seconds. Her hair was plastered to her face and neck. Water ran into her eyes and her mouth, and she couldn't tell if she was crying or if it was just the storm trying to take her apart piece by piece. She tried to get to her feet. Her foot slipped on the wet boards. She went down hard, first on her knees, then her hands, then the rest of her just slid right off the edge of the porch, tumbling into the mud below. The mud was cold, thick, and black as pitch in the darkness. It swallowed her hands clear up to the wrists when she tried to catch herself. It soaked clean through her skirt and her petticoats and pressed against her skin like something hungry. Clara tried to push herself up. Her arm shook, then gave out. Her face hit the mud, her cheek, her mouth. The grit was thick and foul against her lips. She just lay there. The rain hammered down on her back. The mud sucked at her clothes, her hair, her skin. She could feel it seeping through to places mud has no business being, coating her, claiming her. She was Clara Ashford of the New York Ashfords. She had been presented at a cotillion. She had danced with the sons of senators and the heirs of railroads. She had worn silk gloves and pearl earrings and dresses that cost more than most families made in a year. Now she was lying face down in the mud behind a ranch house in the middle of nowhere, covered in filth, sobbing like a lost child, unable to stand, unable to stop. Pathetic. The word just appeared in her head. Her mother's voice, her mother's judgment. Pathetic. She didn't even try to get up. What was the point? Silas was out there somewhere in the dark, probably dead already. Or dying, trampled under all those hooves, his bones breaking in the black mud, just like hers felt like they were breaking now. And she was here, useless, helpless, unable to do a single thing, but lie in the dirt and wait for news she was terrified to hear. Some adventure, she thought, some grand escape from the life her mother had all planned out. She laughed. The sound that came out was ugly, a harsh bark that got lost in the thunder and the rain. She didn't know how long she stayed there. Minutes, maybe hours. Long enough for the cold to seep deep into her bones and settle in like it planned to stay. Long enough for the shaking to stop because her body just had nothing left to shake with. Finally, she crawled back toward the porch, through the mud that tried to hold her down, up the steps on her hands and knees, leaving dark smears on every board she touched, and through the door she had left hanging open. She collapsed right there on the kitchen floor. She didn't change her clothes, didn't wash her face, just lay there on the floorboards, with mud drying on her face and in her hair and between her fingers, staring up at the ceiling while the storm raged on outside. The clock ticked. 4 o'clock. 5. A gray light started to creep through the windows. The rain had stopped. Clara couldn't remember when the thunder had faded off into distant rumbles. The wind had died down to something that was almost quiet. She pushed herself up. Her whole body screamed in protest. Her dress was stiff with dried mud, and it cracked when she moved. Her hair hung in matted ropes around her face. She walked to the porch, grabbed the quilt off the chair, and wrapped it around her shoulders without caring one bit about the mud she was smearing all over it. The air outside smelled like wet sagebrush and turned earth. Puddles filled every low spot in the yard. The mud was thick and dark, scarred with little channels where the water had carved its way through. Clara stared at the northern horizon. Gray sky, gray land, and nothing moving. Minutes passed. The light grew stronger. And then she saw it. Movement, a shape way out in the mist. A horse and a rider, moving slow, way too slow. Clara was off that porch before she even knew her legs had decided to run. She was in her bare feet. She'd lost her boots sometime during the night. She slapped through puddles and mud splashed up her legs. She didn't feel a thing. The shape got clearer, the bay mare lathered in sweat and stumbling. And on her back was Silas, slumped forward over the horse's neck, his hands tangled in her mane instead of holding the reins. He wasn't sitting so much as just clinging on. Clara grabbed the bridle. The mare stopped, her sides heaving, her eyes rolling. Silas. He lifted his head. His face was gray underneath all the dirt. His eyes could barely focus. His shirt was torn at the shoulder, and under that ripped fabric, she could see raw, red skin, glistening and wet. He tried to get down, swung one leg over, and just slid down the mare's side. His knees buckled the second his boots hit the ground. Clara caught him. His full weight slammed into her and nearly took her right down into the mud again. But she locked her knees, planted her feet, and held on tight. He smelled like rain and sweat and horse and blood. "You're alive," she said. Her voice cracked on the last word. "You're alive." His forehead dropped against her shoulder. His whole body started to shake. For the first time since she had stepped off that stagecoach, Silas, the drifter, just let himself be held. Clara half-carried him across the yard. His arm hung heavy over her shoulders. His boots dragged through the mud, leaving 2 long furrows behind them. She couldn't feel her own legs anymore, just the heavy weight of him pressing down on her, the strain in her lower back, and the desperate need to keep moving. Moving forward. Getting up the porch steps was the hardest part. She took them one at a time. Silas tried to help her, lifting one foot, setting it down, then lifting the other again. His hand was gripping her shoulder so tight she knew there would be bruises later. They finally made it inside. She helped him down into the chair by the stove. His head lolled back against the wooden slats. He closed his eyes, his chest rising and falling with every ragged breath he took. Clara did not even stop to think. She pulled his wet coat off, wrestling with the sleeves that were stuck to his arms like a second skin. His shirt underneath was soaked clean through and torn at the shoulder, right where she had seen the raw, shiny flesh. Her fingers were trembling as she unbuttoned it and peeled the wet cloth away from his body. The rope burn was a lot worse than she had first thought. An angry stripe of red and purple ran all the way from his shoulder down across his chest. It was the mark of a lariat pulled way too tight against a desperate weight. Blisters had already formed along the edges, and some of them had burst. In a few spots, the skin had been torn clean off, leaving raw patches that were weeping a clear fluid. His hands were even worse. She turned them over gently in her own, and she felt her stomach twist into a knot. His palms looked like raw meat, all bloody and torn up. The skin had been ripped away in big patches, leaving behind exposed flesh that was already starting to puff up and swell. Clara ran to the bedroom and grabbed the wool blanket, wrapping it tight around his shoulders. She stoked the fire until the old cast iron stove was glowing red, pouring waves of heat into the little room. Then she pumped water into the basin, set it on the stovetop to heat up, and found the cleanest rag she could. She washed his hands first. He did not make a single sound. His jaw clenched up tight when the warm water touched the raw skin. She saw the muscles jump under his stubble, but he did not pull away from her. She gently cleaned out all the dirt and the dried blood and whatever else had crusted on them during that long night. Then she tore long strips from her own petticoat and wrapped them carefully around his palms, tight enough so they would stay put, but loose enough not to hurt. Let the wounds get some air. The gash on his chest was next. She tended to it the same way, slow and careful, not missing a thing. His skin was hot when she touched it, an angry red around the edges, but she didn't see any sign of it getting infected. Not so far, anyway. When she was all done, she put on some coffee, brewed it strong and black. That was how he liked it. She pushed the cup into his bandaged hands and watched as he took that first sip. A little color started to creep back into his face. The gray look began to fade into something that looked more human. His breathing started to slow down. It got steadier. Clara dragged the other chair over and sat right across from him. Her dress was still stiff with dried mud. Her hair was all tangled in matted clumps. She hadn't washed up, hadn't changed clothes, hadn't done a single thing except pour all her energy into keeping him alive. "Biscuits," she said out loud. "I ought to make some biscuits. You need something solid to eat. Stay." It was just one word, but the way he said it, it stopped her, right in her tracks. She settled back into her chair. Silas peered at her over the top of his coffee cup. His eyes looked clearer now, like he could really see her. He took another swallow of coffee, then rested the cup on his knee, holding it gently in his bandaged hands. "You look like you've been mud wrestling a hog," he said. Clara made a noise that was one part laugh and one part sob. "I slipped off the porch and fell right in the mud." "Why?" "I was—" She couldn't get the words out. Her throat closed up. She tried again. "I was worried. I didn't think you were ever coming back. I thought—" She couldn't say the rest. The words just wouldn't come out. Silas just nodded his head, like her answer made perfect sense, like he understood all the things she wasn't able to say. He drank some more of his coffee. Clara watched his throat as he swallowed. She watched the steam curl up from between his bandaged hands, and she waited. "Found him in the canyon," he finally said. His voice was all rough and thin, like it was worn out. "The herd was already running when I got there. That lightning had spooked 'em something awful. 300 head all moving like a single big creature, every one of them just blind with fright." Clara didn't say a word. She didn't want to break his stride. This was the most he had said all at once in the entire time since she had first come here. Rode right into the thick of 'em. He shook his head real slow. Had my coat off, waving it around my head, just yelling and trying to turn the lead steers before they all poured into the valley. He stopped for a second, just staring at a spot on the floor right between his boots. They didn't want to turn, though. They just kept pushing on south, heading for the ranches and the farms, heading for... He stopped again and swallowed hard, heading for here. Clara's hands clutched the bottom of her chair, the wood pressing hard into her palms. "I finally got out ahead of him. The mayor knows that Country Paw's mother trained her on those same trails. She found us a path through a side canyon. That got us out in front of the whole herd. We pushed the lead animals to the east. The rest of them just followed." He looked right at her. "Herd animals. That's just what they do. They follow the ones at the front, even if it's into nothing, even into empty country where there's nothing to ruin." "How long were you out there?" "Hours. I don't rightly know how many. I lost track after the first couple." Glanced down at his bandaged hands. "My horse took a bad step once, went down hard on her front knees. I managed to roll clear. The hooves missed my head by..." He held up two fingers real close together. "About that much, maybe even less." Clara felt her stomach lurch. I got back on and just kept at it. He said it all casual, like he was just talking about fixing a piece of fence. Just the plain facts. The storm finally let up around dawn. The herd settled down in the basin. They were worn out and scared, but they were settled. He took another sip of his coffee. Then I rode back. And that's the whole story. The whole story. Like it was nothing at all. Like he hadn't just ridden all alone into a stampede in the dead of night. like he hadn't almost been killed under the hooves of 300 wild cattle. "You could have been killed," Clara said. He just nodded. Why? That one question just hung there in the air between them. Silas didn't answer right away. He stared at a spot just past her shoulder, his jaw muscles working like he was chewing on words he couldn't quite get down. "Somebody had to," he said at last. "That's not a real answer. It's the only one I've got." "No." Clara's voice was sharper than she meant for it to be. Real sharp. "You rode into a stampede by yourself in a thunderstorm for folks who barely even know you exist. Why?" Silas put his coffee cup down. He rested his bandaged hands on his knees. He looked at her. He really looked at her. And she saw something in his eyes that she had never seen before. It wasn't fear, and it wasn't pride. It was something quieter. Something that had been hiding there the whole time, buried deep under all that silence. Pa used to say... He stopped himself, then started over. "You protect what is yours, even if it costs you everything." He paused for a moment. "Especially if it costs you. But those people are not yours. The Holloways, the Fentons, all the rest of them. They are just your neighbors. Neighbors are what I've got." He looked back down at his hands. "For 3 years now, I've had neighbors in this land, and not a single other thing worth counting." Clara pushed herself to her feet. Her legs were stiff. Her whole body was aching in ways she never knew it could. The dried mud on her dress cracked and flaked off with every move she made. She walked across the little space that separated them and knelt down by his chair. The floor was hard on her knees. She did not care. Silas. He looked down at her. He was waiting. "I came to this place looking for something else. Something that was not New York. Something that was not my mother's grand plans. Something that was not a line of suitors with their pretty words and their empty promises." She took in a deep breath. She let it all out. "I used to think I wanted a man out of a storybook, somebody who would sweep me off my feet with big romantic gestures and fancy speeches. His expression did not change at all. He just sat there and listened. That is not what I found here." Her voice started to tremble. She just let it. "I found a man who puts the coffee on before I even wake up, who hangs curtains all crooked because he never learned how to sew, but he went and tried to do it anyway, who reads the Bible out loud to a sick woman for 4 days straight because he does not know what else there is to do." Her hand found its way to his, her palm against his calloused fingers. "I found a man who will ride into a stampede for his neighbors, who will nearly die for people he barely knows, who just does what needs to be done and never once asked for a thank you." Silas's breath hitched in his throat. "I am not going back to New York," Clara said. "I am not leaving. I am staying right here, not because of some business arrangement, not as just a name written down on a piece of paper, but as your wife. For real this time. If you will have me." He did not use words to answer her. His hand moved slowly, like he was not sure, and came to rest on her hair. It was as light as a bird landing. His fingers were trembling against her scalp. She leaned into his touch and she closed her eyes. When she opened them up again, his face was wet. She had never seen him cry before. She had not thought that he was even able to. "You scared me half to death," she whispered to him. His mouth twitched into something that was almost a smile. "Only half. The other half of me was too mad to be scared." This time he really did smile. It was a small, fragile thing, like something that had not been used for many years. Clara got up from her knees and sat on the arm of his chair. His arm came around her waist, gentle because of his injuries, and gentle with her weight. She rested her head against his shoulder. They just sat like that as the fire in the hearth burned down low while the sun started peeking through the gaps in them worn-out curtains. Outside, you could feel the world shaking off the damp and warming up to a new day. "Clara," he started, "I ain't real good with words. Never was. Don't reckon I ever will be." "I know," she whispered. "But I—" He trailed off, his throat working. "I'm mighty glad you stayed." She turned just enough to press her lips to his forehead, tasting the salt and dust, and that something underneath that was purely him. "Me too," she said. From outside, they heard the groan of wagon wheels in the muddy ruts, men calling out, and the snort of horses. The neighbors were here. A couple of weeks later, wagons began rolling in at sunup. Clara stood on the porch and counted. 1, 2, 5, then 8. They came up that muddy track in a long, slow line. Their wheels churned up fresh trails in the soft ground. Men sat on the benches, tools laid across their laps, things like hammers, saws, levels, and coils of thick rope. The women sat beside them, holding baskets covered with checkered cloths. Martha Holloway's wagon was the first to pull up. She was climbing down before her husband Ezra had even brought the horses to a full stop. She marched right across the yard like a general sizing up a battlefield. "Well," she said, her eyes sweeping over the little ranch house, the weathered old barn, and the fence line that still needed mending. "Looks like we've got our work cut out for us." Clara was standing on the porch in her best dress, a dove gray one with mother-of-pearl buttons, all washed and pressed. She had finally managed to scrub the mud stains from the hem. "I just don't understand. What is this all about? A house raising." His eyes got a little crinkly at the corners. "Ezra went and told folks what your husband did, about him riding into that stampede all by his lonesome, turning 300 head of cattle in the pitch dark." She just shook her head, slow-like. "Word gets around fast out here. Folks wanted to do something to help, but we never asked for anything." "Of course you didn't. That man of yours wouldn't ask for a sip of water if he was dying of thirst in the middle of the desert." Martha gave Clara's arm a gentle pat. "That's exactly why we didn't bother waiting for an invitation." The men started unloading lumber from the wagons, brand new boards that still smelled strong of pine sap and fresh sawdust. They hauled the lumber over to a flat piece of ground about 50 yards from the old house. It was a spot Clara hadn't ever really noticed before. It had good drainage, got the full morning sun, and had plenty of room to expand. Silas came out of the barn. His hands were still wrapped up in bandages, but the wounds had finally healed over enough that he could hold a hammer without flinching. He stopped right at the edge of the yard, just staring at the growing stack of lumber, at the men setting up sawhorses, and at the women spreading quilts in the shade of a big cottonwood tree. Ezra Holloway ambled over to him, put a leathery hand on Silas's shoulder, and said something quiet that Clara couldn't make out from the porch. Silas just shook his head. Ezra said something else. Silas shook his head again. Then Ezra pushed a hammer into his bandaged hands, pointed toward the pile of lumber, and walked off without even waiting for a reply. Silas just stood there for a good long while. The hammer was hanging limp at his side. You could see his jaw working. His shoulders were all bunched up tight. Then he walked over to that pile of lumber and started sorting through the boards. Clara watched it all from the porch. She watched the other men gather around him, not waiting for him to tell them what to do, just falling into place like they had done it 100 times before. She watched them take his lead. "This board goes here. That beam over there." The frame of the house started rising piece by piece, all under his quiet direction. He didn't say much at all, just pointed, nodded, or shook his head when something wasn't quite right. But they followed him all the same. They listened to his silence, just like Clara had learned how to do. By noon, the skeleton of a new house was standing tall against the bright blue sky. It was 4 walls with no roof yet, and no windows, just the bones of something that was about to become real. The new pine wood seemed to catch the sunlight, glowing like pale gold against the darker hills in the distance. Martha suddenly appeared at Clara's elbow, holding a cup of water. "See, I told you, you just stand next to him long enough. He'll start to fix himself." Clara took the cup and took a drink. The water was cool and clean. "I think maybe we've been fixing each other." Martha gave her a warm smile. The lines around her eyes deepened into those familiar crinkles. "Well now, honey, that's just how it's supposed to work, ain't it?" The sun began to dip down toward the western hills. The men kept on working. The younger fellas were up on the frame, while the older ones directed things from the ground. Everybody moved with that easy kind of rhythm that comes from people who have done this sort of thing before and knew they would do it again. Clara helped the other women lay out the food on long tables. Someone had built them out of sawhorses and spare planks. There was fried chicken, biscuits, beans, and 3 different kinds of pie that Mrs. Patterson had somehow baked, even though she never shared her recipes with a single soul. Clara fixed a plate and carried it over to Silas. He was standing near a half-finished wall, checking the level of a crossbeam with a sharp eye. He took the plate from her without a word. He ate while he stood there, the food vanishing in quick, no-nonsense bites. He handed the empty plate right back to her. "Good chicken," he said. "Mrs. Patterson made it," she told him. "Figures." That was all he said. But his hand brushed against hers. When he gave the plate back, his fingers stayed for just a second longer than they needed to. Calloused skin against calloused skin. Then he turned right back to that crossbeam and picked up his hammer. The neighbors all left as the sun went down. You could hear the wagon wheels creaking down the track. Their voices called out goodbyes that echoed across the darkening yard. Their lanterns bobbed in the growing twilight, looking like fireflies heading for home. Clara stood in the middle of what was going to be their parlor. The frame of the house rose up all around her. It was just raw, fresh-cut wood, smelling of pine and all kinds of possibilities. There were no walls yet, no roof, just the shape of rooms taking form out of thin air. She walked through them, one by one, her boots making soft sounds on the packed dirt floor. This one here would be the kitchen. She could tell by the extra supports for the heavy stove they would need. This one was the bedroom, much bigger than their old one. It had room for a real bed, not the narrow cot she had been sleeping on. She stopped in a smaller room off the main one. It had 4 walls roughed in. One opening for a window faced the east, right where the morning light would pour in. It was just big enough for a cradle, and maybe a rocking chair for things that might come down the road. She heard footsteps behind her. She knew the sound of his boots by now. Silas stopped right in the doorway, his bandaged hands hanging loose at his sides. He looked at the little room, then at Clara standing there in the middle of it, her hand resting on the rough-cut lumber. "Thinking?" he asked her. "Imagining," she replied. He nodded. He looked around at the bare frame, the exposed beams, and the sky peeking through where the roof was supposed to go. "Needs work," he said. "Everything does." The corner of his mouth twitched. It was not quite a smile, but it was closer than anything she had seen in weeks, closer than she ever thought she might see. He crossed the short distance between them. His hand found hers. Their fingers laced together, his rough and still bandaged, hers calloused now from weeks of work that would have made her mother back home faint dead away. They stood there inside the skeleton of their future and did not say a single thing at all. The words just were not necessary anymore. The old house felt a whole lot smaller now that Clara had walked through the frame of the new one. Smaller, but not in a sad way. It just felt like it was ready to be something else, like a storage shed, maybe. Or a place for hired hands, if they were ever lucky enough to have any. She sat on the porch with Silas, their backs pressed against the weathered old boards. They both looked out at the new frame, standing there pale and ghostly in the moonlight. The night air was cool. The stars were scattered all across the black sky like someone had spilled salt on a dark tablecloth. Clara reached into her dress pocket, pulled out a worn envelope, and set it down on her knee. Silas glanced at it. "What is that?" "The money from New York. I brought it with me when I came out here." She turned the envelope over and over in her hands. The paper was soft and creased from being handled so much. "It was my emergency fund," she said. "In case things did not work out. In case I needed to run back home." He did not say a word. He just waited. "I want to use it for the roof," she said, "and the windows and whatever else we might need." She held the envelope out to him. "For us." He looked from the envelope back to her face, the moonlight catching the silver in his eyes. "That is yours." "It was," she said, and pressed it into his bandaged hands. Now it is ours. He held that envelope for a good long moment. He did not open it. He did not try to count the bills inside. He just held it like it weighed a whole lot more than paper and ink. Then he set it gently on the porch rail beside him and wrapped his arm around her shoulders. Clara leaned right into him. She felt the solid warmth of his body next to hers. She smelled wood smoke and honest sweat, and that something underneath that was just him. It was familiar now after all these weeks. Familiar and good. A coyote howled somewhere out in the dark hills, a high and lonesome sound. Another one answered from even farther away. "Clara," he said quietly, "I am mighty glad you stayed." She tilted her head against his shoulder. "I am glad you gave me a reason to stay." There was silence. The good kind of silence. The kind that held things between two people instead of hiding them. "I am still not much for talking," he said after a while. "I know. I probably will not ever change. I know that too. And you are all right with that?" Clara looked up at him. The moonlight lit up his face, his strong jaw, the weathered skin, and his eyes that had learned how to say all the things his mouth could not. Tired, worn, and hers. "Turns out I'm just learning a new language," she said. His arm tightened around her shoulders. "And I am still a terrible cook," she added. "Your biscuits are getting better. That is not saying much." There was a pause. It was long enough for another coyote to cry out in the distance. "No," he said, his voice low. "It ain't." She laughed. The sound of it surprised her, how easy it came out, how natural it felt. He made a noise that might have been a laugh, too. It was rusty and out of practice, like a piece of machinery that had not been used in years. They just sat there together on the porch of the old house. The house, and just watched the moonlight shine down on the bones of the new one. Tomorrow was going to bring more work, more neighbors showing up with lumber and with nails, more walls to put up, more rooms starting to take shape. The roof would come next, and then the windows, and then everything else after that. It was a home being built one board at a time, one day at a time, by hands that had finally figured out how to work together. But for tonight, there was only this. Just two people who had found one another in the quiet, who had learned how to talk without ever needing words, who had built something that neither one of them had ever expected to find. When she first stepped off that stagecoach into the dusty street of Sagebrush Hollow, Clara's head came to rest on his shoulder. His chin settled on top of her hair. Neither one of them said a word. They did not have to. Sometimes a story just settles itself into a quiet spot, somewhere between your heart and your throat, and it just stays there for a good long while. This one might just do that. The picture of two people sitting on a porch in the moonlight, looking at the frame of a house they are going to build, together. The quiet between them carried more weight than any words ever could, saying everything that truly needed to be said. I reckon a lot of us have known that kind of comfortable quiet, the kind that is not empty but is instead chock full of meaning. We have stood right beside somebody and understood that love does not always show up with a big production and a bunch of flowery speeches. Sometimes it is in the coffee kept warm on the stove, or in curtains hung a little sideways but put up with real care, or in a hand that finds yours across the table after the sun goes down. Maybe you have carried a love like that in your own heart, one that did not make a big announcement when it walked in the door. And then there is that moment you finally realize the person beside you had been speaking to you the whole time, just in a language you had not yet learned how to hear. It is okay to let this story rest right where it is. It does not need to be anything bigger than what it was. Just a quiet story about two people who found one another in the space where words were not needed. I appreciate you being here. Thank you for sticking around until the very end. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.